welcome. You're here to learn about what's new in ProTop here in 2021. I'm Tom Bascom. I'm with White Star Software. We are the world's oldest independent consulting firm that specializes solely in OpenEdge. We've been doing this since 1987. That was a long, long time ago. We do everything from very small and chaotic customers to the most demanding financial services customers in the world. We see databases and environments of all descriptions, and we're obviously fairly frequent guest speakers at these events. So, you know, if you want more about me, there I am. I've been doing this for a long time too, and let's get to it. Okay, so what's new in ProTop? We're going to talk about a couple of different categories of things. We've got some eye candy because apparently that's really important that things look good for people. We have some older, but they're still fairly new features that you might not be familiar with, especially if you haven't downloaded a new copy in the last 6 months or so. We have some features that are hot off the press that we just released last week. And then we have some web sorts of things. So if you're looking for things in the browser, we've got some new features there too. So let's start with the eye candy. The main topics, or the main things that we've done are, we have more color highlighting. So we've added a lot of colors to the screen to help you to identify what's good, bad, and indifferent. There was a very specious selected row in the browse panels was always highlighted for some reason, so we got rid of that. Lots of user-defined colors, and we have a new dark mode, if you're into dark mode. We have a variable called extra start, so you can start up with your own customized startup panels instead of our defaults. We have a screen refresh key, so that if you are one of those nervous people who likes to wiggle around the mouse all the time and resize your window, you can fix that. And we have a new help site, so let's go through those features. So the more color highlighting. As you can see, the screen has quite a bit more in there to tell you in terms of what's good, what's bad. So if you see something that's green, that means that's a metric that you want to pay attention to that is good. You've got a good value there. Things are in great shape. You should see a lot of green. If you see red, well, obviously that's something that's not good. That's something that you want to pay attention to. So we see here, for instance, that we have 4 BI clusters that are currently in use. So you've got a long enough transaction that you're using multiple BI clusters. Or you see that the read rates are fairly high in the table activity and the index activity. You can see some users that are extremely high activity here. Orange things are more in between. They're more like a warning than an alert. So if you see something orange, it's starting to get bad, but it might not actually be horrible yet. So we have a lot of things like that scattered all through the various screens that you look at that can help you to identify where things are going well and where they're not going so well. Of course, you might not like my idea of what a good color is and what a bad color is. So we have here a screen that lets you select various colors for the various features. If you don't like green for good, you could have some other color for good. And you can fill out all that there. Now, you may not know this. If you are a programmer from the 90s, you may think there's only about 6 colors that you can actually use. That's not actually true. On a modern character application, you can use 24-bit color. And if you look in our ProTerm cap, you can see how to define all those things if you're kind of interested in having better colors than the classic 6 colors from 1991. If you come up with a set of colors that you like, you can save those colors in the local ENV and have them be your defaults instead of my defaults. We also have some predefined color options. We have boring colors, we have the colorful screen, we have a monochrome screen, and of course there's dark mode. So I'm sure that this is really what you were hoping for from a database presentation, but there you go. So here's what dark mode looks like. If you're in the habit of running your screen backwards, then yes, you too can have dark mode. Extra start. So when ProTop starts up, it usually starts up with the dashboard panel and then the table, index, and user information. But not everybody likes that. Some people might want to look at something else. You might want to look at something like the storage area as your default kinds of stuff that you look at. So you can use this feature here to set a different set of panels. So the first thing you do is you dismiss the ones you don't want, and then you bring in the ones that you do want. It's also very helpful if you're on an older release of progress where you sometimes run into an error 49 which is a problem that happens when the screen repaints. It doesn't always happen. Some versions and some platforms are more sensitive than others. What just happened here? But if you do have that, then being able to specify those startup options can be a lot nicer for you. For instance, here's an example of starting with the storage areas coming up as your initial default instead of the usual defaults there. And we have the refresh the screen key, which is Z. So if you're like Paul and you're always fidgeting with the mouse and you're clicking randomly and the size of the page changes, Progress really doesn't like that. The Progress character client freaks out anytime you change the size of the screen, and then you have this screen that has stuff all over the place and you can't ever really get it back. Well, the Z key will clear the screen, refresh it, and redraw it, so you get back to normal that way. And we have a help site. So we've put a lot of work into actually documenting ProTop. And if you go to help.wss.com, you'll see our nice shiny new help site. You can even search for stuff. You can ask me anything. There's actually a chat button, which didn't quite make it onto the screen here. And we have all sorts of content here that will help you to understand what you're seeing in ProTop, what you should do about some of the metrics that you might see, how you would access them. It's all pretty cool. A lot of good stuff there. Hello. There we go. So you can see a detailed explanation of what the initial view is, for instance. Or you can go through all the alertable metrics and see what they are by category, and then see all the gory details of what's behind those metrics and how you might want to think about using them. There's a lot of information here, so spend some time on the help site, dig into it, drill down. You'll find a lot of really good stuff. Okay, so that was the eye candy. That was not all that much fun. But we have some other features that are older but still kind of new. So we've added some new fields. We have a field called DB idle, another one called CSC, or Client Statement Cache Age. We have converted sync IO to megabytes per second instead of just seconds. We have a report viewer. ProTop generates a lot of reports, which are interesting to look at, and so we've added a viewer to make it simpler to do that. We have data collectors that are relatively new for Pro2 and change data capture. We have a new alert on slow after image extent switching and more OS info information than we used to have previously. So let's talk about those features. So DB idle in the client statement cache age. DB idle is really important for active transactions. So the classic problem that you have in a Progress application is a long active transaction where the user is sitting on a screen, they have a transaction open, they haven't committed it yet, and then they go to lunch. An hour later, your BI file has grown to 128 gigabytes and the system crashes. That's not really a whole lot of fun. So we have an active transaction screen, and ProTop will keep track of how long it has been since that session did any reads or writes to the database. If it hasn't done any reads or writes, then it's idle. So this is one of the ways that you can identify the difference between a user who's just sitting there doing nothing versus a user who is actually doing something productive. This is not a metric that you can get from the database, so ProTop has to actually be watching to generate this metric, but the agent that runs in the background will do this for you, as well as the real-time client. The client statement cache is a very powerful feature that tells you what line number of what program last accessed the database. And that's a really, really important thing when you're trying to figure out where to look in your code for a particular problem. But it's also helpful to know how old this data is. So if you have a long query that's been running for a long time, your cache age is going to be longer than something that just goes really quickly. So this gives you more information about which things are really causing a problem versus which things are just incidental to what you're looking at. Sync IO is it's a measurement we do of write throughput for the database. So when you're writing data to the file system, the amount of time that it takes to get that data onto the file system is important. This is the throughput that your write subsystem can support. And what we do to measure that is we run this ProUtil program here. We create a sports database and we grow it by 2 BI clusters. That's 96 megabytes of data, and measure how long that takes. That's a very reliable way to get your write throughput for the disk. And then bring that back and do some calculations on it. We used to just show it in seconds because that was consistent with what we do with random I/O. But we kept hearing complaints from sysadmins and storage admins and stuff. They like to think about things in terms of megabytes per second. That's how they think of throughput. And they didn't like having to do the math to reverse that. So we did the math for them, and now we just report megabytes per second. And as you can see, this is a pretty fast subsystem. We're getting 167, almost 168 megabytes per second out of this system. There's a good chance that none of you have an I/O subsystem that good. This is a very, very good internal SSD subsystem. Most people have numbers that are more like 10 or 20. So there you go. And that's not very good, by the way. The report viewer. So if you type the letter V, then you'll get a list of the reports that have been generated. And you can quickly select one of the reports and then take a look at it. So here we're looking at the database parameter report, which also has some database configuration information and then the individual parameters. So all the database startup parameters are listed within the DB param report. There's also a servers report. There are reports on table information, index information. We have redundant index reports, things like that. There's a lot of cool stuff in there that you can take a look at without having to open a second session and start up an editor or print it out on paper. Does anybody still print anything? Yeah, so there you go. Okay, got a couple of new data collectors for Pro2 and change data capture. So if you're running Pro2, how many people are actually running Pro2? A few of you? Okay, so at a typical conference, I would now say, oh, good, most of you. But you online people, I can't really see. Anyway, if you have Pro2, one of the things that's very interesting to keep track of is how far behind you are. Because you're usually a little bit behind in terms of the replication. You know, you've got the data that's changed, it's working its way through the queues, and you want to know how deep the queue is and what your lag time is. So that's something that people often keep track of. It's good to have a data collector that can go out there and tell you that information. Now, you may be using the newer Pro2 that is based on change data capture, or you might be using one of the older ones that's trigger-based. If you are using change data capture, whether you're using it for Pro2 or for some completely different purpose, there are some similar considerations where each policy generally maps to a table, and there's going to be a first and a last record that has been maintained by CDC, and that'll give you the number of them that are queued, and you know what the oldest change is, so therefore you know what your lag time is. So if you're using Pro2 and CDC, one of the things that you want to know is if I'm having any latency, is that because of Pro2 or is it because of CDC? So if you look at the two different lag times, you can usually tell which component of the application is actually at fault here. Very handy to be able to do that. We have some alerting that's relatively new based on the time that it takes to switch after image extends. So as you're going through your after image process, you have a full extent, or busy extent rather, which then becomes full, which then becomes empty. So as the AI archive manager is moving it from that full status to that empty status can take time because it has to be copied. If that starts taking an unusually long amount of time, then you may have contention for your disk subsystem or something like that going on, and you're going to want some alerting on that. You're going to want to know that the target is falling behind before it gets too far behind. So that's a new set of information you can get. More OS info. So the operating system information, this is an example from Linux, but we have more on the Windows side as well. where we've added a bunch of information about memory and a bunch of more detailed information about the CPUs that you're running on. This is all very interesting, like in Adam's talk that we just had, we had a little discussion about that. And this helps you know what's going on in terms of NUMA, how many cores you have, how fast they are, and what your memory situation is. Okay, so those were some of the older features that have been around a little bit longer. Here's some of the stuff that is hot off the press that we've just released relatively recently here. So we have a new numbering scheme. We've changed the packaging. We're now packaging ProTop in a bunch of ProLibs instead of individual discrete R code. We have a new filtering capability on the user I/O information. And we've improved the formatting of the SQL statements when you look at the client statement cache. And also the df and the mount commands are running in the background rather than in the foreground. So if you have a hung file system, those data collectors don't also hang. So, as you may have noticed, our previous numbering scheme was using digits of pi. We were up to 3.14159. I wanted to go to 3.14159.2, but Paul wouldn't let me. Well, actually, we ran out of space. I would have had to make the screen wider. So we decided that we would change the numbering scheme, and now we're just doing simple integers. We're at version 318. Bit of a jump, but should last for a while. So there you have that. A little bit simpler to communicate. Our packaging, we don't do the R code in the file system. We're now doing a ProLib, and we distribute the ProLib for every supported version of Progress with every download, which is really nice because it means that there's only one download. You no longer have to tell us which version of Progress you're using. You just say Windows, Unix, and boom, down it comes. And really, the only reason for a difference between Windows and Unix is because Windows is a zip file and Unix is a tar.gz. Otherwise, they would be exactly the same. We do put Xcoded source out on the file system. So if you would prefer to run that rather than the ProLibs, you can do so. The source is still distributed, but it's in protopsource.zip. So you can take a look at anything you want. You just have to crack that zip file open. In the R code, as I mentioned, is in the version-specific ProLibs. So that's what all that looks like. Much simpler in terms of being able to support the on-disk side of things. User information. So on your user I/O screen, a lot of times you might want to look at not everything, but a subset of the users or connections. So for instance, you might want to look at just the 4GL clients, just the SQL clients, only batch people, connections, shared memory connections, or maybe you just want to look at app servers or utilities or something like that and see what's going on with them. So you can take these categories and you can say, I want to include app servers, and you could say, I want to include app servers and web speed, for instance, or you could say, I want to include everything except login brokers. So you could, come up with a filtering that makes sense for whatever your situation is. And then you'll get to see the user information specific to that particular category, which can be really handy, for instance, if you're looking for memory leaks in app servers. So you probably only want to look at the app server sessions. You don't care about any remote clients or batch jobs or any of that kind of thing. Very handy to be able to do that. SQL statements have always been kind of a pain in the neck in the client statement cache because they include all the formatting. So if you're using a SQL tool like Squirrel or something like that, and you're writing your SQL and you've got tabs and you've got line feeds and all these other kinds of things, then what the client statement cache is going to show you has all of that in it, so you don't get to see very much of the query itself. So we've eliminated all that white space and just packed it all together, which is quite a bit nicer. You still have a length limit on the line, but you can usually figure out from the first part of it which statement that is and get started on the process of figuring out why your SQL is messed up, aside from the fact that you use SQL instead of 4GL in the first place. Not that I have an opinion on that. If you've ever had a file system hang, so usually it's a network drive or something like that, it's really annoying because you go out and you try and do a DF and it gets halfway through and then it just kind of hangs there and you don't get a return from it. That's a pain in the neck. So instead of running them in the foreground, we've done a couple of things. We exclude the known problem file systems. So if you know you have a file system that frequently hangs, you just exclude it from the list. Or if you know that NFS file systems don't really matter to monitoring the database, you just say, don't give me any NFS file systems. And then we cache the mount data because your descriptions of your mounts don't really change all that often. You don't have to check that every 10 seconds. You don't have to check that every day. You probably get away with checking it annually. So we cache that and we get the data less frequently and run these programs in the background. So if they do hang, they don't hang your session. They hang a little script that's running the output and move on from there. And we've updated the PASOE data collector. So now we're getting a bunch of information directly from PASOE about the number of, obviously there's nothing going on in this system, but the number of connections, requests, reads, writes, errors, all that fun stuff. So you're getting a little bit more insight into what's going on in your PAS environment than was previously available. All right, so that's the kind of the character side of things. And we also have some improvements in the web portal back end of ProTop. So ProTop isn't just the downloadable front end, it's also all the stuff that goes to the portal and the charts and the trending that you have access to there. So we've got more documentation, we have visualizations of the area, table, and index growth trends. We have the corresponding Pro2 and CDC charting that go with the new data collector there. And we have some help screens that are available for the charts themselves. So documentation, again, we have the help.wss.com. You have a K-base and you have an ability to search for things. There's a lot of really great information here. I encourage everybody to spend a little bit of time looking at that. The table area index growth trends. So this is a new thing. If you're collecting DB analysis data regularly, and we encourage people to do a new DB analysis at least weekly. On a lot of sites we do it daily because if you have a reasonable I/O subsystem and your database isn't multiple terabytes, it's not that hard to run a DB analysis. That data gets uploaded to the back end and then you can trend it over time and see what's going on with growth, where your growth is focused. And we have some kind of summary information here which tells you what the growth was for the period and when, as you look forward, you're going to hit certain sizes. So you can see that in a year, we're expecting this database to be just shy of 2 terabytes, for instance. So from a planning perspective, you can go out there and you can think through, well, I'm going to need to have some more disk space 6 months from now. And you can see both the data growth and what's going on with your BI. Now, what you want to see with BI, obviously, is that it's fairly static. You don't want to see a BI that's growing. That would be bad. But a normal pattern is for it to go up during the day, down at night, up in the day, down at night. Here are some information about tables with fixed extents that are above 80%. So if you're trying to manage your fixed extents and you get to a certain threshold, you're going to want to add a new fixed extent. Or you could just go with the, we'll just do all variable approach, which a lot of people find easier to manage. Looking at fragmentation, so tables with fragmentation, that means that the records are being broken into multiple pieces. So when you do an I/O operation, you're having to do multiple I/O operations. That's not really a good thing. So you'll want to consolidate those either through a dump and load or possibly by changing the rows per block or the create and toss limits or something like that. And then indexes that have low utilization. So if you have indexes with low utilization, you probably need to do an index compact utility on those. Then you have information for the top 10 areas with the most growth, how it is they're growing, what's going on there, and which ones are more exciting to look at. And same thing with tables, and if you do a purge, you'll actually see some negative growth. Isn't that fun? Every now and then somebody actually does a purge. Anybody here actually purge data? No? No one purger. Okay, well that's good. CDC and Pro2, so trending again. And what's interesting here is that you can see things like the queue depth and the lag time. So here we had a queue that was down for a little while. So obviously the lag time just increased fairly linearly, and then the queue was turned back on and the lag time disappeared. But you can see whether or not CDC was driving that, because the CDC lag is not increasing at the same time that the Pro2 lag increased. So you know that the problem was Pro2 rather than CDC. CDC was just minutes, while Pro2 was multiple hours behind. So the issue there was on the Pro2 side, not on the CDC side. And coming soon, we're going to have a little help button on each of the charts. We're in the process of populating this right now. So you'll be able to click there and say, hey, what's this chart all about? And you'll have some text there that will help you out with that and give you some ideas about what the metrics that you're looking at mean. Okay, and then we have one more thing. We have the ProTop community website. So if you want to get in touch with us, maybe participate in creating the roadmap, or perhaps you want to report a bug, although I'll dispute whether or not it's a bug. But you can get a login to our community website, and we'll be happy to talk about anything you want there, and interact with you and get your ideas and help you out as best we can. So with that, do we have any questions? Yes, sir.
Do we still have to install ProTop on the database server?
Do we still have to install ProTop on the database server? Yes. Technically, you could run ProTop client server, but we strongly recommend that you run it as a shared memory agent. Yes, it kind of mostly works client server, but your performance is going to suffer. There's a lot of data that goes back and forth across that network connection. And there are some things like the OS info, for instance, that we're shelling out to get that information. So you're going to get OS info about the wrong system if you do that. But the vast majority of it will work just fine, client server. But we strongly suggest that you do it shared memory anyway. Okay? Any other questions? Anything from the chat?
Nothing from the chat.
Nothing from the chat. All right, well, if you have questions later on, join our community site, send me an email, Tom@WSS. Be happy to help you out. And thank you very much.